Hello and welcome to In Progress. I am Raymond Perez. So you may have seen our past video on the top 10 events in the United States. And of course, this show does not just cover American politics, we cover a lot more. So I wanted to also do the same thing for foreign policy. And if we look here, that's exactly what I'm doing. The top 10 events internationally based on the importance of said events, the importance of certain trends, just a variety of different things coming together. There is nothing particularly rigorous about this. These events were chosen because I wanted to talk about them, and that's what this is. So not just that, there's also going to be 20 countries, the G20, and the top event in each country as long as it wasn't already mentioned. Okay, so let's do the top 10 events internationally. Okay, before I begin, I'm actually going to first say that I am not going to talk about the two things on screen now. I'm not even going to mention them, primarily because it will get this YouTube video deranked on the algorithm, which isn't actually particularly important to me, but I also think that if I did, those two would dominate the entire thing, and I don't really want that to happen. So, I'm just not going to cover it. Okay, number 10. So basically, throughout the past few months, there has been this buildup of troops on the Russia-Ukraine border. So you can see here Jens Stoltenberg on the right. He is the General Secretary of NATO. And of course, NATO is the primary alliance that the United States has. And it's a very real way that the United States exerts its influence over Europe as well as Canada. So basically, NATO has backed Ukraine in this most recent dispute in a way that it didn't really in 2014 with the crisis in the Crimean Peninsula, when Russian troops basically annexed the peninsula into the Russian Federation. So basically, this is a big deal. However, I don't see it being a huge deal. I kind of see this as Vladimir Putin doing his normal Putin things. And what I mean by that is whenever the approval rating of Vladimir Putin goes down, he does some nationalist, some overture to nationalism in order to increase his approval rating. It happened in 2008 with Georgia. It happened in 2014 with Crimea. And it seems to be happening again because Russia, under Vladimir Putin, is seeing a lot of unrest due to due to very bad outcomes with COVID-19 and a variety of other economic woes. So Russia and NATO seems to be an issue that can continue into the next year, but I don't see it having that much staying power beyond that if Vladimir Putin's approval rating rebounds, which with the recession of COVID, by recession of COVID, I don't mean the economic recession. I mean that COVID will probably not be as important next year. I don't really see this as being a huge deal. Moving on. Number 9 is the RTSS vaccine. So basically, malaria is a big killer in Africa. However, it doesn't really kill many adults in Africa. It primarily kills children. So the big thing that this new vaccine does, and it's not particularly new, it actually finished development in 2015, I think. The European Medical Agency, the EMA, approved it in 2015, and there was some trial runs in Eastern Africa in 2019. However, it was approved, I think, in August or October of this year. I get those 2 months confused for some reason. I don't know why. But it was approved this year, and it seems that it protects children. I think I saw something like an 80-something% rate of protection, and that's huge. So a malaria vaccine can really cut down on deaths in Africa, and that actually helps Africa develop, as it seems to be poised to do over the next few decades. Moving on from this, let's do number 8, which is the Evergrande fiasco. So why is it so low? Well, you may have heard of Evergrande, which is this Chinese real estate company that has a lot of holdings in real estate, and it's generally considered too big to fail, right? It's one of those conglomerates that is extremely powerful in China. However, of course, in China, it does not have the institutional framework for corporations to even near the power of the state. So, Evergrande had its hiccup, as I mentioned here, in the sense that it defaulted on its debt. So basically, there was a movement by Xi Jinping in, I'll say 2019, but I don't really remember when, about these like 3 red lines. And basically, those 3 red lines meant that corporations could not be too over leveraged, meaning that their debt had to fall into certain categories. It couldn't be. There were certain ratios with the equity of the company, the assets it owned, and with cash on hand that they couldn't really surpass those ratios, or they would face consequences. So basically, what occurred was that Evergrande, due to certain movements in the Chinese markets, was unable to pay back the debt that it had taken, which was actually what the Chinese government had feared in terms of these 3 red lines. So Evergrande had its default, which spooked markets for a day in September, or maybe a week or longer in China, but it didn't seem to have the staying power of like the Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008. If it did, however, we would definitely know, and it would have 100% been number 1 or number 2 on this list, because it would have caused a global recession, if not a depression. So Evergrande could have been much bigger, and I think it's something to look at over the next year, because it's actually not finished, but it doesn't seem to me to have the staying power of something like Lehman Brothers in 08, especially given, everything else that's happening. So you can probably see that we are already at number 8, and we're getting into really big stories. So let's continue on. So number 7 is another huge story, and it's Operation Allies Refuge. This was the American evacuation from Afghanistan that was, for all intents and purposes, on the global stage, a failure. Of course, I mentioned in my other video on the US that in Afghanistan it wasn't a failure because, we left, which was the primary objective. But if you look at it from a strategic standpoint, a standpoint of this is the grand strategy, to borrow a term from Gaddis, it is pretty bad for the United States to just like abandon an ally. Of course, the Afghanistan government was notoriously corrupt. Ashraf Ghani, who was the president of Afghanistan, and I think also associated with Johns Hopkins University in some way. I don't really know how he was associated with it, maybe an alumni, but he was. Regardless, that government just completely collapsed. And the United States abandoning that government, which was basically the only reason why the United States was there, really, just to have, like, I think we may have had like 2,000 troops there, maybe less. And we were just there to make sure it didn't collapse. And then the Taliban took over in the span of a couple months. So that was completely silly from a certain American perspective, from a certain global perspective on America. Whether I do actually support the evacuation from Afghanistan, because the United States has other domestic issues that are more important, but from a foreign standpoint, yeah, that is definitely something that would spook many people, especially the Ukrainians and the Taiwanese, who Anthony Blinken, who is the Secretary of State, actually, I said Anthony, it is Antony, which is weird because there's no H there, it's very annoying, but he basically, went around in Ukraine, Taiwan, said, we're not going to let you collapse, but it's still something that can upset many policymakers around the world. So moving on, number 6 is the German election. So Angela Merkel, who was the chair of the center-right CDU, the Christian Democrats, which is, the center-right party in Germany, her party, without her at the helm, Armin Laschet had taken over in 2019 or 2020, depending on when Karrenbauer left. Regardless, her party lost to Olaf Scholz, who is the leader of the SPD. Now, there are a lot of questions here. about what this means for Germany's role, not just in the EU, but in the world writ large. Merkel was, as you may know, a very major proponent of the European Union. She is what we would call a Europeanist. She was extremely powerful in the EU. She, I think, had ruled since 2005, right, after defeating Gerhard Schroeder. And I wanted to do actually a retrospective on Merkel, but basically didn't because that's not really news. It's more of a history thing, and I would rather do that if I did a history show. But regardless, Merkel, who had her very stable hand on the ship of state for 16 years actually. She navigated Germany through the Eurozone crisis, through the remainder of the Iraq War, which Germany had never entered, with COVID-19, the migrant crisis, etc. There is so much that Merkel did, and it's a question of whether Olaf Scholz can live up to that legacy. For right now, Merkel's Europeanism, her view of European integrationism, seems to be in line with that of Olaf Scholz. However, it's important to note that Olaf Scholz is more of an Atlanticist, and what that means is that he wants to pursue relations across the Atlantic, right, with the United States. So that's pretty extreme in terms of German policy, because Merkel was primarily a Europeanist. She wanted the EU to be itself a center of power. It's questionable whether Olaf Scholz wants the same thing. So that is something to continue looking at. We also have to talk about Germany's moves against Russia and China more extensively, although that began under Foreign Secretary Heiko Maas in 2018. And we also need to look at the coalition partners that Scholz has, which is the Greens and the Free Democrats. The Greens, of course, being a Green party. They definitely support major change in the climate. Well, major change in climate policy, which is good for the climate issue. And the Free Democrats, however, are these centrist neoliberals almost, and they definitely would not support something that heavy. So it's important to look at what Scholz will do in the next few years, and he's in there until 5 years from now, 2026. So something to continue looking at. Okay. Moving on. Inflation. So inflation is a very, very huge topic right now. And this is something that I got red-pilled on by a Financial Times article. Basically, the Financial Times, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, the Financial Times basically said that, and I agree with it, that you can basically predict how stable a country will be based on its rate of inflation. And here, a major reason for the instability in the world right now, of course, putting aside the pandemic, is, rising food prices. And rising food prices, yes, they're because of the pandemic. However, food prices are basically, they rose by 40% over the past year. So that's huge, right? If you're living in Turkey, which is going through a massive inflation wave, if you live in Poland, if you live in Brazil, if you live in these countries that are becoming more unstable, the question remains, right, is this because of these rising food prices? And will we see this transitory inflation eventually dissipate? And when will that happen? What roles will need to be taken by the central banks of these countries? Because a lot of central banks, even today, are not raising rates as quickly as they probably should. I think... which country has rates? Oh, Russia. Russia is, I think, the only country that has interest rates higher than their inflation rate. So this is huge because that means that inflation can continue running. And inflation, when it starts, it's pretty difficult to stop. So that's big. And you can even see that inflation is lowering the standard of living for many people in the world. So that's huge, right? And if you look at American inflation, which is 6 or 7%, year on year, which is not really the good way to measure it, as I've mentioned before in previous videos, this is nothing compared to the double-digit rates and even triple-digit rates in other countries. So inflation is huge, but we'll need to see how much that goes on into the next year. I expect it to be pretty forceful in the next year as well. Number four is the corporate tax agreement that was reached in the G20 meeting this year. So basically, this is something that didn't get that much coverage, but I think it's extremely important because I think right now we're seeing a major accumulation of corporate power. You can see this in America with Amazon hitting record profits, these various corporations hitting record profits without much government oversight. And as I mentioned in the US video, you're seeing antitrust and a few other mechanisms try to curb this. You're even seeing this in other countries. You're seeing this in China, right, with the massive $3 billion fine on Alibaba this year, which is the Chinese e-commerce giant. And you're beginning to see, right, a merger of even state and corporate power in certain areas of the world, including China. So how do states combat corporate power? Because, of course, the state, as an engine of politics, right, it has a vested interest in curbing corporate power, right? That's what the state is not meant to do that, but the state does that as a function of having a monopoly on violence, etc. We can get into political science later. But the question is, how do they do that? And the answer is through taxation. This is a major way that that countries can really curb something's power, right? Corporations, especially, are hit by corporate tax. And nations like the United States, with a fairly high corporate rate, last I checked, I think it's 28%. It could be a little bit lower. I forget. Well, actually, Build Back Better hasn't passed yet. So, and I say yet because I think it will pass. But regardless, putting that aside, nations with higher corporate tax rates are disincentivized from having them because it makes them less competitive. Because corporations try to start in good environments with low barriers to entry into the market. And corporate tax is a fairly high barrier to entry, especially if it's much higher than the OECD average. So what the G20 is trying to do is they agreed on a minimum of 15% corporate tax in every country by 2023. So this is huge because this is the first step in sort of leveling the playing field between many nations. So this is extremely important and should not be understated. Moving on, a so-called climate reckoning, as I'm calling it, as number three. So this is another really big topic. Of course, we saw the acceleration of climate change this year in the same way that we see it accelerating every year, except for, I think, 2020, which had a brief break because of the pandemic. However, I'm not going to talk about like COP26 or these various climate summits because I think they're mostly bullshit. Pardon the language. Or, no, actually don't pardon the language. They are mostly bullshit. However, I think legal action is much more important, and that is what occurred in the Netherlands in March of this year, when Royal Dutch Shell, which is, of course, Royal Dutch being in the Netherlands, Shell had to Shell had to reduce its carbon emissions by, I believe, 40% or 45% by 2030 as a result of one of these landmark decisions. So basically, a few environmental groups, they sued Shell in Dutch court because they basically said, hey, these massive carbon emissions are going to create such huge negative externalities that basically will be affected for the rest of our lives. So we need to actually get some compensation, or Shell needs to reduce its carbon emissions. And the Dutch court agreed, and they said, yeah, we agree with that. And Shell needs to now reduce its carbon emissions. So we are beginning to see a move against oil and gas companies, which is huge, because generally individual power, which is important, but is not really a major way to fight climate change, is now being pointed to as less important than corporate power. And the Dutch court agrees and is moving against corporations now. That's huge. Okay. Number two is the new Cold War. So I was reading something, and basically I heard this interesting argument that the new Cold War began when Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States signed this AUKUS agreement, this AUKUS alliance, that was meant to contain China. So you're beginning to see a new move to contain China in the same way that the United States tried to contain communism in the Soviet Union's sphere of influence in the 1950s. So you're beginning to see a major shift of the United States from, terrorism, which used to be the major issue that the U.S. fought after 2001, the war on terror, and moving that into a Cold War with China. So China is also, for its part, also ramping up the Cold War by talking about maybe at some point in the future uniting with Taiwan, or Chinese Taipei, as they would say. And China is, again, beginning to expand its influence in the much talked about, probably over talked about, Belt and Road Initiative, and with a variety of other ways that it's expanding its influence in the regions. Well, I said in the region because I was talking about Asia, but then had to change that to regions because it's actually not just Asia. So the United States is beginning to move against China in a very real way. And basically, a huge reason for this is the pandemic, which was blamed for a variety of reasons on China because it originated perhaps in Wuhan. And there is a lot of talk about America and China having much worse relations into the next year. And China is moving against Taiwan, and the United States is, trying to stop that, I guess, in certain ways. So there's a lot there. However, we can't really talk about all of it, so let's instead just talk about briefly the Anchorage talks, which is when, it was, I believe, in February of last year, where the United States basically said, China's doing bad things with the Uyghur population, a genocide perhaps, and it's also, what was the other thing they discussed? Oh, the crackdown in Hong Kong, just like a variety of different human rights abuses. And for their part, China responded with the same accusations, talking about systemic racism and the murder of George Floyd and a variety of other issues that have impacted the U.S. So there's no love lost between the two countries, and we're beginning to move into a more hawkish regime between the United States and China. Which now leads us into the honorable mentions. Basically, how I'm going to do this is 20 countries, the G20, and a few regions where I'm going to name one event this year that I think marked a major change. Okay, 30 seconds for each event. Canada. Justin Trudeau, the leader of the Liberal Party, held his government in an election with Erin O'Toole of the Conservative Party. Nothing really much changed there, but there's a question of how long Trudeau can continue to do that. In the United States, you had January 6th, which was a major event, and you can watch my coverage of that on the other video about the U.S. In Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador kept his presidential majority. If you don't know, he is on the left in Mexico, and however, he did lose ground because of issues with the pandemic. Moving on, Alberto Fernandez and his Justicialist party, which is the Peronist party in Argentina, which is a center-left authoritarian ideology. They lost their majority for the first time since 1983, which was when they first started doing elections in Argentina. Well, after the dictatorship. Okay, in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro's popularity collapsed. And you may remember this major issue in September about January 6th in Brazil that basically ended up being nothing because Bolsonaro's popularity was pretty low. Moving on. In the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson's government is under scrutiny because he went to he didn't go, but the Conservatives held a Christmas party that was not supposed to happen because the entire country was on lockdown. So major issues there. It's not just that, but that was a major thing. They lost a huge by-election in a constituency that the Conservatives had won for since 1820, right, when it was created. In France, I picked a few things, but let's just say the rise of the far right. There was a letter talking about civil war by certain French generals, and they said that France was falling into Islamism, which, is silly on its face, but they said that. And Eric Zemmour also declared his intention to run. We will definitely cover the French elections into the next year. In the Netherlands, Mark Rutte of the VVD, which is a center-right party, remained prime minister. And I think he actually got the same exact coalition too, which is hilarious. In Italy, Mario Draghi, who was the former president of the European Central Bank, which is like being chair of the Federal Reserve, he came out of retirement to fix the political crisis that the country found itself in at the beginning of the year. He also is pushing a major reform package that we will see what happens there. In the European Union, there is a judicial battle with Poland that is still unresolved, and we'll definitely cover that into the next year. I have a video talking about it if you want to know more. Moving on. In Russia, Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, was arrested, and there were widespread protests, not only after Navalny's arrest, but also after United Russia won the legislative elections, despite having lost a lot of popularity. So there were questions about voter fraud there. Moving on with that, in Turkey, we'll definitely cover this into the next year, and we have a video on this, I believe. Erdogan's popularity is hurt by inflation. The Turkish lira is spiraling out of control, and Turkey is doing very badly. He's not up for re-election in 2022. He is up in 23, and we'll see whether that changes beforehand. Moving on, Saudi Arabia. I couldn't really think of one for this one, so I'll just say rising oil prices have led to a budget surplus in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman hasn't really been doing too much this year, at least compared to like every other country in the world. In India, a farmers' bill protest threatened Modi's popularity. However, he seems to have rebounded from that, so I'm just going to skip it. Also, by the way, the farmers' bill protest is actually extremely important. I think it's the largest strike in history, but I can't really cover it here. In South Africa, there were riots after Jacob Zuma, the former prime minister, who I think is Zulu, right? He was jailed, and that was bad for South Africa under Cyril Ramaphosa. Moving on. In China, there was an increased crackdown on Hong Kong, an increased crackdown on the Uyghurs, and a crackdown on Alibaba that we briefly discussed. In Japan, Fumio Kishida won a general election. He is part of the Liberal Democrats, who have basically ruled Japan since 1945, when it, got nuked. And he has pursued a stimulus package. In South Korea, Moon Jae-in of the Democrats was hurt after a property corruption scandal. Theoretically, Moon is more popular than his predecessors have been. However, his Democrats are doing pretty badly in by-elections, which bodes pretty poorly for next year's election. So expect a governmental change in South Korea. Moving on, in Indonesia, couldn't really think of one here. It's been a good year for Indonesia, except for COVID. Let's just say that startups are at a record high, and Indonesia continues its march into the future. Australia, the AUKUS deal was approved after issues with the People's Republic of China, and we have, I think, already discussed that. And I think that rounds out the G20, so let's move into other areas. In the Caribbean, Haitian President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated. A lot of things are still happening there, so I can't really talk about much more than that. And there were protests against the government in Cuba. In Latin America, the Pink Tide 2.0. The Pink Tide, if you don't know, was the increase of socialism in Latin America in the early 2000s. And Pedro Castillo, who is the leader of Free Peru, and he ran as a Marxist, but is kind of governing as a center-left leader. He defeated Keiko Fujimori, and Gabriel Boric defeated Cast. Well, I can't remember his first name, but that was in Chile. So the left has won many elections in Latin America over the past year. In Ethiopia, the Tigray War deepens. The Tigray are an ethnic minority in northern Ethiopia, and there is a massive war there right now that's not getting that much coverage, and it is continuing to go on. The free trade agreement in Africa that was signed in 2019 is taking effect, well, it took effect last year. However, there are some questions there about whether that means more cooperation or whether it's just going to fall by the wayside as it kind of has over the past year. We'll see. In Israel, of course, you have the conflict with Palestine in May of this year, and Netanyahu was replaced by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid in a very, very weird coalition agreement that you can definitely learn more about in a video that I have. And finally, Ibrahim Raisi dashes hopes for a nuclear deal. To be fair to Raisi, it's not particularly his fault that the nuclear deal died. It was primarily Trump's fault because he pulled out of it in 2017. But him doing that sort of discredited the moderates in Iran, And Racy, who is a hardline conservative, won because of that. Well, not because of that, because he jailed a lot of his opponents, but like also basically what the US did not help at all with the Iran question. And finally, number one, drum roll please, as I put on my camera, we have our, wow, that was bad, our new normal. Our new normal. Basically, it is the idea of our existence right now is predictable unpredictability. I stole that from The Economist. But basically, the idea is that if there's one thing this year taught me, it is that you cannot predict anything that is going on. Not just in international relations, not just in domestic policy, but not just with the pandemic. Just everything is completely unpredictable. So for this, I put Evergrande, that remember that one ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Basically, it didn't cause a supply chain crisis, of course, but it created a massive glut of shipping for 3 days that really, really, really hurt the supply chain. And we are now knowledgeable, right? The supply chain, we can't just completely ship it outside of the country, right? But you also can't have it inside the country because as we know from international trade, right, certain nations have comparative advantages over others in terms of, creating products. So we now know how fragile our entire system is. It's not just a pandemic. A ship can clog the Suez Canal for a day and completely disrupt the entire thing. So basically, it shows us our new normal is not whatever's happening with COVID. Our new normal is not the pandemic. It's not wearing masks. It's not getting vaxxed. It's not getting the jab, right? Our new normal is the idea that you cannot predict anything anymore. You can't predict anything. Everything is unpredictable. The only thing you can predict is that you do not know what's going to happen tomorrow. Okay, so with that, that concludes the top 10 events of this year. Not necessarily great events, not necessarily fun events, but events that I think have extreme staying power over the next year. So I will just remind you to like, comment, or subscribe depending on where you're watching this. I will also remind you to stick around because we're going to have coverage from an institutional and progressive lens of world and US events over the next year on this channel In Progress with Raymond Perez. If you'd like to watch more, of course, subscribe, as I just mentioned. And with that, in 2022, we must remember the change we need to see is always in progress. Thank you for watching.